Roman curse tablets are these small, thin sheets of lead with inscriptions carved into them that archaeologists have found throughout what was once the ancient Roman Empire. These inscriptions, as the term curse tablet would suggest, most often call upon the gods to do horrible things to some person or people who the writer feels has done some sort of wrong. And when I say horrible things, I mean it.
The human who stole Verio's cloak or his things, who deprived him of his property, may he be bereft of his mind and memory, be it a woman, or those who deprive Verio of his property, may the worms, cancer, and maggots penetrate his hands, head, feet, as well as his limbs and marrows.
Sometimes these were directed at a specific person and would have been either buried in the ground near the home of that person, or in some cases might even have been placed in that person's tomb after their death.
I ask you, Lady Mater Magna, that you avenge me in the matter of the fortune of my husband Florus, the one who has deceived me, Eulatius Severus. Just as I write this wrongly, so shall everything that he does, everything he undertakes, everything should go wrongly for him. Like salt and water shall it go for him. Everything he has taken away from me from the fortune of my husband Florus, I ask you, Lady Mater Magna, that for this you avenge me.
Sometimes the writer didn't even know who had committed the offense. For instance, it was not at all uncommon for people to have their unattended property stolen from them while they were relaxing in the bathhouses. And apparently, Romans didn't take kindly to having their things taken from them.
To the god Mercury Arverius, I complain to you, Lord, concerning my property, a cloak and hood. Whoever stole this, whether slave or free, whoever stole this, the god is not to let them stand or sit, drink or eat, unless they redeem it at your temple with their own blood.
Other times, the writer might not know who had committed the offense, but they had a list of suspects, and the curse would ask for the god or gods to indiscriminately do harm to the whole lot of them.
May he, who carried off Vilbia from me, become as liquid as water. May she who obscenely devoured her become dumb, whether Velvina, Exuperius, Verinus, Severinus, Augustulus, Commissionus, Catus, Minianus, Germanilla, or Jovina.
These curse tablets were essentially ancient Roman Twitter or ancient Roman Snapchat. They're often brutal and petty and take advantage of the fact that they're anonymous. The writers were brutally honest in expressing their feelings because these words were meant for the eyes of someone other than the person being cursed. And these curses had periods during Roman history when they were very popular. And since there was no way to know for sure if someone had petitioned the gods to curse you, many people took precautionary measures, such as wearing the evil eye on their bodies or writing counter-curse tablets, often naming someone that the writer suspected might be plotting to curse them.
Veraka, thus it is with your business. You act twistedly, even as this writing is twisted. Whatsoever you wish for us shall come down on your head.
Now, if that isn't the ancient Roman equivalent of I'm rubber and you're glue, whatever you say bounces off of me and sticks to you, then I don't know what is. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, I want you to understand that as I talk about the art of ancient Rome and the seriousness and sternness that it communicates, that this was the public persona that the Romans wanted the world to see. In reality, once you look at something like the curse tablets that we've just been talking about, or the Roman graffiti that we find that the common people scribbled on the sides of buildings, you realize that they were just as petty as we are today in the 21st century. These were people, just like you and me, who got mad when their shit was stolen from them. And I just want you to keep that in mind as we dive into the art, architecture, and the public projects of ancient Rome. There will be many societies that will come after them, that will look back to them as these great, heroic, stoic, moral people. They were just assholes like you and me. All right, let's dive into it. Hey everyone. Just to let you know that what you're about to see is an old recording from last year. This should be the last time I do this. I'm feeling quite a bit better after my really bad bout with COVID. But by the time I was recording this, I still didn't quite feel like going through an entire hour and some change of a lecture in recording. But I think by the next one I'm going to be in good enough shape to do that for you. But I did at least want to record what was that short little intro that you just watched, and record this little bit right here. Just letting you know that, again, what you're about to see is a recording from last year. I've tried to remove anything from it that mentions the book, because of course you guys don't have the book this semester. So I tried to make sure that I took any of that out. But if I accidentally left anything in and you still hear something that refers to pages in the book, please ignore that. I'm also going to come in and jump in at one point because I've added a couple of new slides to this lecture that weren't there last year. I wasn't planning to get COVID. I had a whole plan for this lecture. And while I don't necessarily quite feel like I could take on the entire lecture right now, I do feel like I could handle a few minutes to talk about these two slides that I've added in. So when it comes to those, you'll hear from me again. All right, so anyway, we're talking about ancient Roman art and architecture. Last week, in week 7, you got the background from Professor McIntosh when it comes to the ancient Romans. Right? She gave you the background, the ideas, the history, things of that nature. We're going to dive into the art that the Romans made. And when we talk about that, when we talk about the art that the Romans made, the art and architecture, that is, we kind of also need to get into some of the public projects and the utilitarian things that they built. Okay, all right, I'm going to stop talking and let old Jason from a year ago take over. So, ancient Rome. For the purposes of this lecture, I am going to be breaking down the artwork of ancient Rome in this lecture to 3 specific periods. The period of the Etruscans, I always fumble that word, the Etruscans, who are actually a group of people who predate the ancient Romans. The Roman Republic, which goes from about 509 BCE to 27 BCE, and Imperial Rome, the time in which Rome was an empire, which goes from about 27 BCE, there's no about on this one, to 476 CE, the year that is marked as the fall of the Roman Empire. So the Etruscans. The Etruscans were a group of people who came before the Romans, and as such are the earliest influence on Rome. They're quite mysterious, actually, because their written language, I wrote here the written language has not been deciphered. So a little bit has been, but not enough to really tell us anything much about the Etruscans. And so little of what they wrote survived that even if we could kind of eventually get it deciphered, who knows if what little survives could even tell us anything. Interestingly, they did adopt the Greek alphabet to write their language with, so we know very little about them culturally as a result. They occupied this region in the northwest area of the Italian peninsula, which would have been north of where Rome was founded. And I have here that their origins are unknown, and for the most part, that's still true. However, your book mentions that some DNA testing has been done as of late that seems to suggest that the Etruscans may have come from the Turkish peninsula, and then immigrated to this area, this region of Italy, somewhere around 3000 BCE. However, I didn't change what this says on the slide here, because I think that on at least one version of the quiz, I will have a question that asks where the Etruscans originated from. And anybody who hasn't bothered to watch this lecture might just look at this and just see the words unknown origins and not realize that we have some evidence as of late that the Etruscans may have come from the Turkish peninsula. So if you're watching this and you happen to get that version of the quiz, good job on you for watching the actual lecture. When it comes to Etruscan, why do I keep trying to say it like that? Etruscan art and architecture, we know that they built temples, though none of them survive. We know that they used a modified version of the Doric order that they inherited from the Greeks. The Etruscans were very enamored with the Greeks. We can tell in a lot of their art and architecture and things of that nature that they were looking at what the Greeks were doing, and seem to incorporate a lot of their culture. They also built these elaborate tombs that they would decorate with sculptures and frescoes. A fresco is a term for a painting done on a wall, specifically in a technique where one puts wet plaster onto the wall, smooths it out, and then paints into that wet plaster really quickly before it becomes dry. This was a technique that ancient peoples developed for painting walls, and we still use it to this day. The sculptures and frescoes were vividly colorful as well. We'll look at an example of a fresco, and you'll see for yourself. Their sculpture, as I just mentioned, they were looking at the Greeks, and so their sculpture is very reminiscent of archaic Greek sculpture. In fact, you may even notice that archaic smile in a piece that we'll look at in a moment. All right, so the Etruscans. The Etruscans were in essentially this little area that you sort of see as the dark pink area, right? This is, while the Greeks are over here doing their thing, and the Romans haven't really formed much of anything yet, right? This little area down here is where the Romans would eventually begin to build their culture. The Etruscans are up here doing their thing. And here's a piece that's let me move myself over here. This is a piece that is indicative of the type of sculpture that we find of the Etruscans. This is a sarcophagus, so this would have been a piece in which someone would have been buried from about 520 BCE. And it appears to be a husband and wife, given the closeness of the two of them. And they're reclining, eating dinner. This seems to be the way that the Etruscans ate, as opposed to sort of sitting at a table like we do now. We know that for a good bit of the time, the Romans also would have sat down to eat in the same kind of way. The piece is monumental and stiff in some ways that are, again, very reminiscent of the stiffness of archaic Greek sculpture. But also there's this sense of intimacy as the two of them touch each other, share a close space. There's even a sense that if we still had the pieces of what they might have been eating, because you can tell that their hands are shown to be like they should be dripping something. So if we had the items that they were eating, it even kind of looks like they might be offering food to each other. It's a beautiful, intimate little piece that seems to showcase the type of relationship that the person who was buried in the sarcophagus wanted to express about themselves and their spouse. There's warmth in their smiles, but again, notice there's that archaic smile I was just talking about, right? The way that it just sort of unnaturally curls up, right? And we see in their faces influences of archaic Greek sculpture as well. Maybe a little bit of Egyptian, but it kind of makes sense because the archaic Greek sculptors were looking at the work of Egyptian. However, this is so much more relaxed than anything that we saw in the archaic Greek period, right? Relaxed and supple. There's certainly that sense of stiffness I was just talking about, at least in sort of the upper torsos of these individuals and in their faces, right? But there's not the kind of insistence upon, symmetry, if you will, or sturdy, rock hard, standing on the ground immovability of that monumental nature of a lot of the archaic Greek sculpture. There's a willingness to allow the figures to be in a more relaxed position rather than the very straight, harsh, and very geometric lines of archaic Greek sculpture. So here is the moment that I mentioned I would be coming back in, current 2022 Jason would be coming back in and giving you this information, right? But just got a couple of slides here where I want to talk about the architecture of the Etruscans. There's not much of it that survives. The ruins are in very poor condition, as you can see from this temple of Belvedere, as it's referred to, from about the 6th century BCE. We don't have a lot of it. Not much of it survives. We're pretty certain from descriptions of these temples that a lot of what would have existed above this foundation that you can see might have been wood, and wood doesn't like to stand the test of time nearly as much as the stone that we see everywhere else. But we do get a sense of some architectural trends that the Etruscans had from the footprint of this ruin, as well as from some architectural drawings that were done by a Roman much later, based on temples that were in much better condition. Etruscan temples that hadn't completely gone into ruin like ours have. Well, not ours, but the ones that we can see now have. Right? He was looking at those and might have even had some written descriptions from Romans from even before his time. But he gave us these architectural drawings to sort of showcase what the temples of the Etruscans were like. And so some particular features stand out when it comes to Etruscan temples. First is this really, really deep porch or portico on the front of the temple, right? We go back here, right? We can see that the actual interior part of the temple was way back here, and that all of this out here was a portico or porch, right? That was sort of transition space. One would step up, walk up these steps, and then have this long porch that would be covered, right, by a very Greek-inspired upper portion here, and then would enter the sanctuary being a much smaller portion back here. So that porch, or portico, those words can be used interchangeably, and this sort of central stairway leading up to it, with the temple, the actual sanctuary of the temple being much smaller and toward the back, those are all Etruscan ideas. And it just occurred to me that I've spent a lot of time teaching this particular lecture, and never actually looked at any Etruscan architecture. Again, much of it doesn't exist, but still I wanted to talk about it at least. This would have been This is an example, rather, of one of their burial tombs, which, as I mentioned, is covered in frescoes. Again, these would have been painted into wet plaster that would have been applied to the wall, and ours would have painted and put very quickly before it dried. You can see, because as we look down into this area, hopefully my mouse cursor is showing, you can see where some of the plaster has flaked away over the years. I mean, this was created in somewhere between 480 and 470 BCE. It's a pretty old piece, so it makes sense that some of it has flaked away. The Etruscans didn't have the advantage, say, that the ancient Egyptians had of living in a desert, which is why so much of their stuff is so well preserved. It seems to depict a banquet. Right? Now, we don't know why. Is this meant, like the Egyptian artwork that we looked at, is this meant to showcase how the individual or individuals who are buried here hoped to live their afterlife? Or is it merely just a slice of life scene? Hard to say. But we see diners reclining on couches who are eating and drinking. They're being served by two male waiters. Maybe, like I said, it insinuates that the afterlife will be a continuation of the good times had on Earth, but it's hard to say for sure. Now, again, as mentioned, clearly some Egyptian and Greek, particularly archaic Greek influence here. But something that we saw the Minoans doing. I didn't cover Minoan art in my lectures, but we talked about the Minoans who came before the ancient Greeks. One thing that they did in their art a lot was that women were portrayed as very pale, and men were portrayed with sort of darker, more ruddy skin. So the two genders were treated differently in art. And it seems like the Etruscans were doing the same thing. As we can see, the males all have this very warm, ochre type skin, and the women are so pale that they are essentially the same color as the plaster that forms the negative space beyond them. This is a particularly interesting piece. It's we refer to as the chimera of a Razzo. This piece, as you can see, would have been produced somewhere around 400 BCE. And it's regarded by many historians as the best surviving example we have of Etruscan sculpture. It would have originally been part of a larger sculptural group that illustrated a Greek mythological story about a chimera, this creature here, this chimera, in battle with a Greek mythological hero. This piece is a bronze. So it's not carved stone. In order to make this piece, the original sculptor would have first had to have made the piece out of something like clay, and would then have had to have built a mold around it, out of which the clay would have been removed, and then bronze would have been poured in. So this showcases the sheer mastery that the Etruscan artisans seem to have when it came to bronze. That alarm is like the third or fourth interruption I've had while trying to record this. Okay. But yes, as I was saying, master manipulators of bronze, the Etruscans were. I will refer you to Professor McIntosh's discussions on exactly how the Romans sort of got their first beginnings. I'm going to talk about the moment they sort of are a republic. So in talking about the Roman Republic, the Romans rise to power in about 509 BCE after they overthrew the last of the Etruscan kings. I forgot to mention that earlier, but one small snippet of information that we have about the Etruscans is what others wrote about them. But what others wrote about the Etruscans is skewed, because either it would have been somebody that the Etruscans conquered writing about them, and it's kind of hard to trust what they had to say, or it would be what the Romans wrote, and the Romans conquered them. So what they wrote is a little hard to trust, right? They created a republic, a system ruled by the people, slightly different than a democracy, at least different than the Greek democracy. Remember everything again that Professor McIntosh told you about how their system worked, right? All of that. I'm not going to go over that now. They began warring with and conquering their neighbors in Italy and Greece once they were powerful enough, and eventually extended out until they became an empire. The Roman Empire is established in 27 BCE when Augustus, the first emperor, rises to power, and he and the emperors who come after him start really reaching out and conquering the known world. At its height, there were large portions of Europe, Eurasia, and northern Africa that were all under Roman influence. So, just for the fun of it, let me move myself out of the way again. In my search for some sort of a video or animation of some sort that illustrates not just the rise and fall of Rome, but also how it fits in with the timeline of things that we've been talking about so far, like the Greeks and now the Etruscans, I came across this video that amuses me because it is exactly the kind of teaching aid thing that teachers brought in when I was a student back in the 80s and 90s. And so I even decided I'd stick it in an old TV on a TV cart. So you get the real experience of what it would have been like to have been young Jason back in the day watching something like this. Right? But for all of that, for how funny it is to me, it is an excellent illustration of the rise and fall of Rome and how it fits in with what's going on at the same time. All right, so let me play this.
As we begin, we see the spheres of influence of different cultures marked by different colored lines. Time will move at the rate of 8 years per second. We see the Greeks fairly static and fairly disorganized. The great empire of Carthage and the vast domain of the Persian Empire. Rome appears as a small settlement on the Tiber. As Alexander's empire, the Macedonian Empire, begins to grow, it takes over most of the known world. On Alexander's death, his generals carve up his kingdom into many smaller kingdoms. Now Rome begins her expansion, collapsing the empire of Carthage and pushing in the boundaries of the Greek Empire. Carthage, compressed to a small enclave, finally falls in the same year that Athens is taken. Now Rome continues her expansion and the Parthian Empire appears, which will remain almost static for several centuries. Rome expands to the east, collapsing the vestiges of the Greeks, and also begins expanding north. Her boundaries will remain relatively constant for almost 400 years. She begins her expansion into England, which will finally reach a northern boundary at Hadrian's Wall. We see the barbarians, formerly completely disorganized, begin to form a group of states with boundaries which will eventually begin to expand to the east. There are actually many small fluctuations in the border of the Roman Empire, but the mass remains almost constant. Now we see particularly venturous barbarians, the Goths, begin to extend their sphere of influence very far to the east, and at the same time the Huns, making a southward migration, begin to come towards them. There is finally a confrontation between these two forces in one of the greatest nomadic expansions in history. The Huns force the barbarians through the northern wall of the empire, causing it to begin to collapse from within. Finally, in 476, the kingdom of Dalmatia, the last vestige of the Western Empire, collapses, and it's all over.
So, yeah. You saw the copyright, you may have seen the copyright of 1989 on that thing. I came across that thing and I was instantly transported back to my middle school days. That's exactly the kind of thing they would have put in front of us back then. All right, so a few things that are important to understand about that. We've got the city of Rome, right? The expansion outward from there, the conquering of the empire of Carthage in northern Africa, and then just spreading, right? Now, eventually, you saw that split, where the empire split in half. We'll talk about why in upcoming lectures. Then you saw all those little barbarian kingdoms to the north are starting to pop up. Don't forget them, because they're about to become very important when we get to the Middle Ages and to the fall of the Roman Empire. So yeah, the Roman Empire at one point was massive, right? Conquering everything that we see within these red lines, and then there are even some other areas that have dotted red lines around them that sort of indicate areas that were sometimes under influence, sometimes not. The northernmost point of the empire was in Britain, but they never quite got a good foothold into Scotland up this way. So let's look at the art, finally, of ancient Rome. Let's look at sculpture in ancient Rome. Now, as we've already mentioned, when we were talking about the Greeks, right? We have so many examples that we have of Greek sculpture. We have only because there were Roman sculptors who made copies of what at the time were surviving ancient Greek sculptures. But we've since lost the original, and we only have the Roman copy to go on. So we know that the sculptors of ancient Rome were looking at the Greeks and looking at the work they were creating, liked what they saw there, and were incorporating a lot of those same techniques. As we see right there, it was influenced by classical and Hellenistic Greece. Like the Hellenistic Greeks, however, they preferred realism over idealism. The Roman sculptors and painters, for that matter, they didn't mind to show people with all their wrinkles and warts and all. Right? They didn't try to make people look like some sort of perfected ideal. They liked for people to just be people in art. So they're very much like the Hellenistic Greeks in that way. Unlike the Hellenistic Greeks, however, a lot of Roman art is very stern and moral. From the Roman point of view, very moral, that is. They take things very seriously, the Roman sculptors, and usually some sort of a lesson is being imparted. Yeah, all right. So here we have a couple of really great examples of Roman sculpture. Over here on the left, patrician with busts of ancestors. On the right, we have a statue of Augustus, both from somewhere in the early 1st century CE. Now, again, we can see the Greek influence happening in these, right? There is the contrapposto pose. The Romans grabbed onto that, loved it, started employing it in all of their sculpture. So in both cases, we can see that the figure has their weight on one foot and not so much on the other, giving them that classic S-curve shape of the contrapposto. Though the way that these sculptors are treating fabric in both examples here is very reminiscent of the Hellenistic Greeks as well, and their sort of fascination with getting hard stone, in this case it would be marble in both these cases, to look like thin, wispy fabric, right, in folds and bunches and twists, and that realism is there, as well as the realism of Hellenistic Greeks to showcase wrinkles and all, right? Our patrician over here, and for that matter, the bust of his two ancestors. There's no indication there that we want to hide that these are old men, because they have reached a certain age, and given that they are patricians, they are men who are meant to be looked up to, not only by their family, but by Roman society as a whole. And so being old and wrinkled and not perfect and young and athletic are all markers of that status. But then you get over here to Augustus, right? And Augustus, this is a statue that would have been made after his death. And by this point, it seems like there is a turn toward looking to classical Greece for models, right? For how to make one look. Because in this particular case, he does seem to be more idealized, right? He is certainly in this sculpture younger than he would have been when he died. His wife, after his death, commissioned this piece. And it was meant to sort of showcase Augustus as the founder of the Republic, right? So look to Augustus in that way, right? This is our great leader, and all of the emperors who are to come after him should look to him as well. And they did so by making him look very much classical Greek. I mean, he looks very much like the spear bearer. Clearly, the sculptor would have been familiar with, if not this specific piece, probably would have been very familiar with the work of Polycleitus, right? But there's certainly a difference here, right? Yes, you have both of them hearkening back to Hellenistic Greece. You have the statue of Augustus hearkening back to classical Greece. But there's a big difference. The figures are clothed. Right? The Romans, they were a little more like us in that they were a bit less comfortable. They were far less comfortable with nudity than the Greeks had been. They're so much more stern and serious than the Greeks in that case. Speaking of husbands and wives, here we have a double portrait of a man and wife that would have been done somewhere in the late 1st century CE. And this is a small double portrait. I mean, it would have been a double bust, if you will. A bust, again, is a sculpture that's usually just going to be head and shoulders, right? The joining of their hands is indicative that they are married. That's the reason we assume that we are looking at a man and wife. And again, there's the borrowed Hellenistic style that's being showcased here in that fabric and in the lack of idealization. The woman may be a little more idealized. She does look like she's maybe been made to look a little more smoother skinned, but dude over here, not so much, right? We've got wrinkles and knotty fingers and all, right? Like, we're not trying to idealize and make them look perfect. We get the feeling this is done from observation and is trying to capture what the sculptor's eyes are actually seeing. This is how they would have appeared in life. Symbolic of the wife's role, her hand is on her husband's shoulder, which is there in a gesture of support. Again, I refer you back to everything that Professor McIntosh has given you about the Romans. A very patriarchal culture, so a woman's place was to be supportive of her husband. We're shown an intimate closeness between the two, but their faces are not those same faces that we saw in that Etruscan sarcophagus, right? Where there was a warmth, there were smiles, right? No, these two are very stern. The stern faces that have no emotions, right? Not like those Etruscan pieces that we looked at all, right? There is a theme of moral fortitude in a lot of Roman sculpture. One can certainly have their close personal intimate connections with other human beings, but one is still responsible for self-control and being a morally upstanding citizen. And that gets communicated even in something as simple as this little portrait of a husband and wife. Then a big thing that we see a lot in ancient Roman sculpture are what are referred to as equestrian statues. This one in particular being of Marcus Aurelius, sculpted sometime around 173 CE. And an equestrian statue is just simply a statue of someone riding a horse. Right? It is a genre, if you will, of sculpture that after the fall of the Roman Empire is going to go away for a good long while and will really only be returned to when we get to the Renaissance. So, by putting Marcus Aurelius on this horse, he is represented as a warrior emperor. That seems to be what he wanted people to see and understand and know about him. Equestrian statuary became really popular in Rome at the time because it really showcased just how skilled a sculptor was, right? Because a sculptor needed to not only be able to sculpt a human being with flesh and bone and hair and clothing that they're wearing, but also needed to be able to handle the horse and all of its proportions and sinew and muscle underneath skin and all of that, right? So that sculptor's skills were going to be shown off in just the sheer amount of textures and anatomical understanding that had to come into play. But again, Marcus Aurelius's face is stoic and unemotional, even as we get the feeling of sort of leading his men forward. He's emotional. He's keeping himself under control. He's doing it, right?